The conclusions is that phase when it comes to writing reports. It's one of those phases where you're so relaxed because you've done all the chunky things. Now you're finally up to the conclusion, and you're so relaxed. And I think this, has an impact on the quality that we give in our conclusions, because we focus so much of our energy onto those key sections that we kind of undermine the conclusion. And you have to remember that the conclusion is the last piece of, text, nice last chunk of text that the reader will actually, engage with before they leave the paper. And so it's really important that you leave a good impression. So how do you write the conclusion? How do you perfect the conclusion? And so today we're gonna, look at a few key concepts. And since the conclusion is really short, there's not many key points when it comes to writing a conclusion, but I do say that we'll still look at, examples, and we'll look at how a good conclusion is made. So let's get straight into it. Okay, key points. The conclusion is the summation of all experimental findings in the context of the aim. And it also should address the hypothesis. And remember, the experiment does not necessarily have to address the hypothesis. So you want to have this summation of all your experimental findings. So it's like, a small recount of each section in your report, and then you sum up with all your experimental findings. But another thing is, you don't want to make this sound bleak. I believe that every stage of writing a scientific report, you want to show something of yourself. You want to show some character. You want to, this scientific report, how films, when you watch a Christopher Nolan film, you're like, yeah, this makes sense, it's a Christopher Nolan film. It's that style, it has that Christopher Nolan style. Or when you watch a Steven Spielberg movie, you're like, oh yeah, this has that style that is, evident in the rest of his films. I think scientific writing also has that kind of connection, this auteur connection, where, when you have your own style of writing a scientific paper, and you want to communicate that style to the readers. You want the reader to feel, what's going on in your head. They shouldn't be just given a recount on experimental findings. You want to also give them a take-home message. And this is the second point. And here is where you think about the only piece of information that one needs to describe the topic at a considerable depth and explain the purpose of the paper. And so you want to, create this character, and you want to give them that take-home message. And so this should be, that piece of information that they can use to describe your entire paper and explain the paper's findings. And they should also be able to use the conclusion to talk about why your research is important. So you want to have the summation of all experimental findings, but then you also want to show some of that character, and you want to give them that take-home message, because ultimately it's up to you what insights and what applications you give them. And so you want to make sure that the insights and application you give them are, not only are important, but they also show your character as that scientific writer. Because if you notice, you have a film, and then you have extended cuts and, deleted scenes, because it's about what the, director wants to show you. Similarly, you want to show something to your readers. And that's something, and you have to keep that character alive throughout your entire presentation. Next, now let's look at the generic conclusions model. So there were only two key points. So when you're writing your conclusion, you want to start with what was in the paper. So you give them a recount. Then you talk about what the paper or study has achieved. So now you're looking at, the positive aspects. Then you want to provide relevant background information. So if someone's just skimming through this, they should be able to pick up those key relevant background pieces of information, and they should be able to use that to explain your paper. Then this is kind of, you're at the introduction stage right now. And then you want to give the gap, aim, or the need to study. So why was it necessary to study this? And now you've finished with the introduction. The first four parts were in the introduction. Fifth part, you want to give them the method or the approach. Don't spend too much time on this. Just give them a generic idea. If they should be able to, get a good idea of what happened, but it shouldn't be too specific. If they want to, get a specific idea, they can refer back to the section itself. So the method or approach, key results with evaluative comments. So here is where you talk about your key results, and you give them those evaluative comments. And evaluative language, evaluative comments are really important, because here is where you tell your reader, you kind of subconsciously, ingrain in the reader's mind that I want you to look at the results in this manner. And so if you say there was a striking drop between here and there, then they will look at the strikingness of the drop. And so if you want to get, a better idea of how to, show character in how you write, look at my video on writing the results for a scientific report. That has a good chunk of information on how to use evaluative language to direct your reader in the direction you want them to. So now you want to, spend one sentence on the key results and where you want to lead them to. The seventh part should be spent on the implications of the results. What subtle conclusions can we get from the results? Now, then you want to go a bit into the negative side. What were some limitations? Now, when you write about the limitations, make sure that you're not overemphasizing the limitations. Make sure that you're giving the limitations, but then you're also talking about why this could have positively happened, or you're minimizing the potency. Because when you talk about the limitations, you show character. But if you start overemphasizing them, people will think you're a clumsy scientist. So talk about your limitations, provide, like, this was a limitation, but I think this is why it happened. This is what can be done to mitigate it. And this also goes back to this. Now we're in the discussion stage, right? When you're talking about the limitations and implications. Then you want to go back to positive. Talk about your applications. And now you want to end on a positive note. You don't want to end on limitations. So now you're going to talk about how your study advances knowledge. And then you want to give so basically you want to talk about what is the importance of your study at the end of the day. And as I say, you want to lead your researchers, lead your readers in a direction, right? And so now you want to give them potential future directions for research. So like, let's say you had a limitations. You can put one of your limitations in here and use it to end on a positive tone. This is a limitation that I had. This is what we can do to, fix it. And people will be like, oh, I can fix this guy's limitation. I can run another experiment and I will not have to face this limitation. And what they will do is that they will run your experiment and then they'll, find this limitation and they'll use your limitation as, a direction for their research. So they can cite your paper, that this paper talked about this, but this was a limitation. So let me, redo the experiment without this limitation and see what happens to the results. And so you're giving this direction to, the serious readers that are really, concerned about your paper. So let's look at an example now. So this is about the rate law analysis of water oxidation on a hematite surface. This, as you can see, I've put the sources on here and refer to the sources if you want, a more detailed explanation. But essentially what I've done here is I've taken the conclusion, I've taken the purpose of the text, and I've tabulated it so you understand it better. And so let's take a look at this. The rate order of the water oxidation reaction has been investigated on hematite, photoanions, and photoinducers. So first of all, the writer outlines the key content of the paper. Yeah? Okay, our transition from the first order to third order in photogenerate holes. The writer dwells into the discussion section, so where the key achievement of the paper has been identified. So you go straight into what was the key achievement of the paper. And so this one, and obviously, like I said, that you want to, recount your paper, but another thing is this also depends on how other papers in the field are written. So rather than just strictly following this model, you want to look at how other people have written those papers, how other people that have done, rate law analysis have written the paper for this case, and this person did that, and this gives them an idea of the type of language they should use. The writer, and then in the third section, this transition was confirmed by agreement between three of them, was rationalized by considering the rate limiting of information. So the writer provides background information for context or for the upcoming parts of the conclusion. Now in the fourth and fifth part, what they do is that they provide an argument that is then used for the starting point for the need of their investigation. So now they're talking about why their investigation was actually needed. It is argued that this rate law is consistent with the reaction mechanisms based on recent observation of intermediates, blah 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 blah. So now they're introducing why you need to do the research. Then the writer uses evaluative language to identify the key results. So now that you've demonstrated the need for your study and given your reader an idea of what the results might show, you jump straight into the results. And here is where the reader has talked about the results using evaluative language. So let's take a look at this. I can say this study demonstrates the ability blah blah blah, but what they've done here is that they've used evaluative language. They've said this study clearly demonstrates the ability of a metal oxide semiconductor surface such as hematite to drive multi-hole reaction, but also highlights the modest catalytic properties of the surface. So now they're telling the reader that look, now they're making a subconsciously a dent in the reader's brain, like look, I want you to look at this piece of information. Don't look at the graphs and stuff, but look at the graphs, but look at this specific part of the graphs. And so this is what they've done here. Now you want to look at some potential applications. That's what they've done here. Our findings will help tailor the design of metal oxide anodes for the need for photocatalysts to enhance function. So what does this paper do? How does this paper impact the field or the industry that you're in? Finally, the potential for further research in the field of future work is currently in progress with the different materials and ways to determine the function of each catalyst complex but fascinating reaction. So you end off with a positive note and you comment on the way on the direction of the field, of where the field is headed. And yeah, this is pretty much it. And yeah, I don't think they've talked about limitations in this example. Yeah, there's nothing much on limitations, but I think, this is just, I see it, the limitation of the conclusion section, where they mentioned the limitation of the research, is actually in the last part. And so here they've talked about further work is currently in progress, where they talk about, this reaction with different types of papers, different types of materials, right? Sorry, not papers, materials. And so the key limitation of this paper was that it could only test for one material, hematite surfaces. But that limitation has been now being addressed by other papers that are testing it on other materials. And so and in this case, the limitation is presented at the end, because this limitation provides further direction for the research, and they're giving that direction. So although it may seem that although at first I thought there was no limitation of this paper, there actually is a limitation. And that limitation, as they've talked about the limitation very briefly, and then they've said how this limitation is being addressed by other papers in the field. So that's very smart. Now you're writing about a limitation and no one even knows that it's a limitation. So yeah, that's something that you want to do. Try and minimize your limitations. Like, talk about your limitations, minimize them, but focus on your solutions, or focus on how it's being addressed. So yeah, that's what you want to do. Okay? Yeah, that's it. Bye. That might have been, including limitations might have been decided based on if it was needed for this specific field, or this specific industry that this paper is concerned with. So yeah, I mean, so what I say is that this scaffold is very general. The first thing that you should do is look at other papers in your field that you're writing your research paper about. So find other papers from places like ResearchGate and see how they have written about the topic, and then you want to use their structure on the conclusions. And then if there's still doubts and stuff, you can refer back to this model. But yeah, that's it, and that's how you write the conclusion. Now the only thing that's left is the abstract, and the abstract should always be written last. So in the next video of the series, we're going to look at how to write the abstract. Till then, I hope you've learned something, and if you've enjoyed this video, that is very good. I'll see you in the next one. Keep grinding. Bye bye.